So in my conversations earlier this week with Tom and Conrad, I was getting them up to speed on the theme, and they threw out this little light of mine, but we're saving that for next week because we've got a light going on with the passage. And then Conrad sent out the words of that Dylan song that's printed on your bulletin. And I went, yeah, it's like that. So, this quote from Richard Rohr suggests that grace and mercy were not always part of the Christian theological conversation. The emphasis for so many years was on judgment and exclusion. And we created a world built on those norms. And then the 60s came.
Come gather round, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, well, you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are a-changing. Welcome writers and critics who prophesize with your pen, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And watch what you say, for the wheel's still in spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming. And the loser now will later win, for the times they are a-changing. And fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly changing, so get out of the new world if you can't lend your hand, for the times they are a-changing. Line it is drawn, the curse it is cast. It just as the present will later be past. The slow one now will later be fast. The order is rapidly changing. Yes, and the loser now will later win, for the times they are a-changing.
What's curious, of course, is that all the images on the screen are images from the last century, not the Middle Ages. Thanks, you guys. My theology professor at McGill suggested that the finest prophets of the 20th century were the musicians and the artists. They were doing the work and pushing the communities in a way that theologians weren't quite. I think when we think about the life of the community that was created around the teachings of Jesus, we need to understand it as a pilot project. The disciples were all Jewish, and the lines, as we heard last week, even in the words of Jesus, were strictly drawn between Jew and Gentile or other. And these lines were ingrained in the culture. And so the early church assumed that these teachings from Jesus were meant for the Jewish people alone. And Jesus himself began with that perspective as well. But very quickly, Peter and the others realized that this tradition, this renewed tradition, was pushing them to color outside of the lines. And among the practices that kept them inside of the lines were the dietary laws. Kashrut is the body of Jewish law dealing with what foods can and cannot be eaten and how those foods must be prepared. These laws determined with whom people ate, and more often than not, served to exclude many from the table. And even the language, and Peter refers to that language, people were understood as clean or unclean. That was the lens through which the faithful chose to see the world. And so Jesus developed a reputation for ignoring these laws. People raved, he eats and drinks with sinners, which didn't just mean that, oh, well, he was hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors. It is more likely to have meant, or over and above, that he ate and drank, probably with the poor and all those within the community who could not afford to practice these laws, and as a result were considered by the faithful to be unclean or outside of the community. And so I suspect that in this story we are looking into what was probably the most profound epiphany within the earliest Christian community. And while the conversation around dietary laws is foreign to us, the ways in which we create a them and an us in our communities and in our world, well, that's still not a foreign conversation. But rather than looking at all the places where them and us still exists in our world, I'd like us to think about some of the reasons why we keep creating thems and us in this century in particular. I tend to think that these categories are born out of a worldview of scarcity, which unfortunately is a place where many of us live our lives. We're afraid that there's not enough to go around, there's not enough opportunities, there's not enough jobs, there's not enough love. We respond with fear. We need to protect what is ours because in our understanding of how the world works, there's not enough for everyone. It was this kind of manipulation around scarcity that gave Hitler his initial power in Germany. It is this kind of manipulation around scarcity that is giving Donald Trump some of his power. And so how does this function when it comes to religious traditions? Well, I think it's interesting. I think it goes something like this. There really isn't enough unconditional love. There is not enough grace. The road to salvation is narrow, and so we have got to make sure there is room for us on this road. Too bad that there's not room for everyone. And so we project our own understanding of not enough onto God, or the mystery that we call God. There can't possibly be room for absolutely everybody in God's community. And so, because we believe that, we throw up criteria for earning God's grace. A good behavior, a contrite heart. But as soon as you use that kind of language, you have then opted out of the model of grace, which suggests that everything God gives to us is free. We opt out of grace. We opt out of free love. We opt out of unlimited compassion. Yet that is the vision of God that Jesus has revealed. And people over the centuries have had a hard time with it. It didn't fit their scarcity model. So, like the quote I threw up on the screen, people just went back into the scarcity model. And this is how the scarcity model in terms of religious traditions translates. There are no room for Protestants in God's community. Or there's no room for Catholics in God's community. Or you must be born again, or you must speak in tongues, or you must... You fill in the blank. Richard Rohr suggests that this constant, that we, because of who we are as human beings, are constantly having to come up against the scarcity that we create, the walls that we throw up, the lines that we draw. And goodness knows who and what we put on the other side of them at any given day. But he suggests that as a result, we're always having to stay on top of our own fear and anxieties, which, of course, most likely often exist at an unconscious level. So, you don't like, fill in your own blank. You don't like why exactly? Can you explain why you don't like that person, those people? Is it rational? Can you somehow get to the bottom of the fear that is undermining your ability to see the world differently? I think that what's important for today's conversation is to recognize that in order to have the kinds of epiphanies that Peter had in this dream, in order to have the kinds of epiphanies that the change agents in our world have to manage to get beyond some of our history, some of our fears, some of the anxiety in the culture, in order that we shift from a worldview of scarcity and inward-looking to abundance and outward-looking, we need to be engaged in some sort of spiritual practice. I'm going to share with you some thoughts from Richard Rohr. The natural flow of grace is largely impossible, he says, when we're holding on, when we're stingy and petty and blaming and angry and playing the victim, or in any way feeling offended. We need to notice when we're in that place of scarcity. And we're usually like this. He continues, I believe that's what morning prayer is for, or meditation, or walking the labyrinth, or a walk in the woods, or you fill in the blank, to bring me back in alignment with the divine flow so that the infinite source of compassion can once again flow into me and through me. Great love, great suffering, and some form of contemplative practice, he says, are the usual paths that help me get my small false self out of the way and become an open vehicle for the gushing grace and compassion of God. People often ask me, because he's a spiritual director and a teacher, how long should I pray? And I say, as long as it takes you to get to yes. If your heart and your emotions are still saying no to the moment, to the neighbor, to the enemy right in front of you, Don't leave your place of prayer until you find yes. Until the flow begins to happen and the constriction and anxiety and resentment begins to lose its hold on you. Then you're abiding in a place of abundance where you know there is more than enough of you left over. And you don't need to be stingy, and you don't need to be guarded, and you don't need to hold on to those grudges. You can let the quiet love flow. You can let grace happen to you and through you. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about how it's really the end of the old order, or the end of 100 old orders, and how, as much as some of those places and attitudes were questionable, we were comfortable back then. We knew who our neighbors were. We kind of thought we knew what everybody thought and what everybody should do. We knew what the rules were. And now, it's crazy. Lines are being redrawn at exponential rates. And the question to a person of faith is, what are you going to do about it? Dig in your heels? Live your life as though there's not enough and you have to hold on and be angry and resent? Or, in keeping with some of the heroes of our tradition, are you going to go, oh, okay, I guess we got a whole new ball game here, and my calling in the middle of it is to be a mediator, a vehicle of love and hospitality? I'm going to suggest, as we move into this contemplation time, I want you to consider what epiphany you need, what divine surprise, what encounter with mystery will get you beyond any latent hatred or fear or distaste for whoever you decide is them.